Today I want to deal with what happens when community starts to go wrong. We've all had this experience, I am sure, when a conflict begins, when we don't see things the same way as somebody else. And I don't know about you, but it's one of the hardest things in life, isn't it, to manage conflict well. And we're constantly wrestling with questions when we find ourselves in that situation. Maybe you've had conflict in the home, in the workplace, in church, amongst your friendship group. We face these challenges all the time of knowing how to deal with people who are not seeing things the way we're seeing them. And the key question we face in life is, when do we just endure something and when do we confront something? Seems to me that is one of the questions that requires the greatest wisdom we could ever draw on. Jesus said, "Blessed are the peacemakers." And I'd really love to sit him down and grill him a bit about that and say, well, what do you mean by a peacemaker? Is it somebody who just endures everything? Is that what you mean? Or can you be a peacemaker and at the same time be confronting something? And what does that look like? Conflict, it seems to me, is an entirely normal part of life. Sadly, we will all face it in different ways. And at times it is undeniably necessary to confront things. It's just really difficult to know when. I spent some time this morning reflecting on the causes of conflict. Here are a few. I'm not suggesting this is an exhaustive list, but I think this hits the main ones that I've come across. First of all, obviously just plain old wrongdoing. If somebody is misbehaving, that causes difficulty as we begin to grapple with their behaviour and decide whether to confront it or not. But it might not be actually them doing something wrong. It could just be that they're behaving foolishly, unwisely, that there's a good intention behind it, and perhaps it's hard to say what they're doing is actually wrong, but it's not very wise. Incidentally, one accelerator of conflict is gossip. It seems to me when you've got a conflict, we love adding our two penneth, don't we, into the mix, and that just accelerates conflict within a community, as very often half-truths are passed on and shared, and the whole situation gets inflamed. Another cause of conflict is when we don't understand ourselves very well, or we don't understand others. And so our limited perspective means that the way that we see the world rubs up against the way someone else sees the world, when we're both seeing things from a limited perspective or perhaps a lack of understanding. We all come from different backgrounds, we have different education, we have different experiences, we have different cultural experiences, and all of that surfaces in different attitudes. And so how we think someone should behave and how they think they should behave often diverge. And then we get misunderstanding and we begin to think badly of each other. We have different motivations in life, and sometimes those motivations can clash, as I'm trying to achieve and drive in one direction, and maybe you're trying to achieve and drive at another direction. Another cause of conflict is when there's a limited resource of some kind, and this is true of nations and it's true of individuals. And we compete for those limited resources. Maybe we're competing for a position of authority, or we want status. Or we're trying to outperform others around us and trying to sort of draw to ourselves a certain degree of approval. Now, one question that is an important question is, does this happen in the church? Some people approach church and perhaps understandably, but a bit naively, think, well, this is the community of God's people. So surely all of these Christians, surely this is the haven where there wouldn't be all of those problems. And yet in the Bible itself, we don't even have to touch on church history. In the Bible itself, we read a lot about conflict. If you read the end of John's Gospel, for example, you'll find an underlying suggestion. It's not quite explicit, but there appears to be tension just in those early days after Jesus' resurrection, there appears to be tension between the Apostle John and the Apostle Peter. Later, the Apostle Paul, who definitely had a bit of a track record of falling out with people, manages to fall out with a character called Barnabas. Now, Barnabas was a nickname, and that name meant son of encouragement. So I ask you, Paul, what sort of character was he that he managed to have a significant falling out with someone who was known by everyone as the son of encouragement? I think Paul was probably quite a prickly character, actually. Paul and Barnabas had such a sharp sort of falling out that they actually went their separate ways. But as I'll point to later, the interesting thing is that having gone their separate ways on a mission trip, God then used both of them, and they ended up reaching more people than they could have done together. That's an encouragement to us when we struggle with conflict, that God can even use our failures in a positive way. He is bigger than our failures. Paul also managed to fall out with Peter, and he also managed to fall out with the Corinthian church at various points, if you read those letters. So conflict is not just a question of out there, it's something that happens undeniably in the church. And so let's go back to that question, can God work amidst conflict? I've heard people say, well, if there's conflict in the church, God can't work in a church like that. I think, well, then God's not going to be working in any church. Because there's always going to be conflict in the church. I think the truth is God has no choice but to work with people who have a tendency to not see eye to eye. And in fact, throughout church history, some of the great movements of God have been birthed in conflict. I'd love to give you a few examples of that, but we'll move on. Romans 8:28, of course, which Mark preached on last Sunday evening, says that even in our failures, God can turn them to good. He can use even the things that we mess up, he can use for good. So this is encouraging to you if, like me, you can look back on occasions where there have been conflicts that you've been involved in that perhaps you haven't handled very well, or that haven't been resolved how you'd like them to be. Even when that happens in the church or even in your family, be encouraged that God can use that for his good, because he is so, I'm going to say clever, which seems a bit of a weak word when described to God. He can turn even our mess-ups to good, which is very encouraging indeed. So I have met Christians who at the first sign of conflict think the Christian thing to do is just withdraw. We'll think about this for a minute, in a moment or two. I think the typical or the colloquial expression for this is to be a snowflake. Christians don't have to be snowflakes. Now, neither do they have to become sort of T-Rexes either. But you don't have to withdraw at the first sign of conflict. That's not the Christian way, and we shouldn't be frightened of it either. Well, back to the text that we started with, having said all of that, and I'm just going to draw a few lessons out of it, and I think we may continue with this theme next week and say a bit more about it. But first of all, I just want to make the point that in this passage, particularly in this parable of the unmerciful servant, and if you're not familiar with it, really, please go away and read it a few more times, because it's one of Jesus' best parables. You know, a lecturer at college used to refer to some of these parables when I was at Bible college as zingers, by which he meant if you read them, they just get right under your skin. And this is one of those for me. I think some of the teaching of Jesus is one of the main reasons I'm a Christian, because his teaching is far superior, I think, to anything I've ever come across anywhere else. And just in a few simple words, by telling a simple story, he completely reorders our approach to this question of conflict, and really our attitude that we take with us into our relationships with others. So Peter comes to Jesus and he asks a question that if you have never posed, Well, if you said to me you'd never posed it, I wouldn't believe you. He asks this question and says, how many times do I have to forgive someone if they wrong me? And he says, 7 times? Now, if you're familiar with the Bible, you know that Jesus is about to tell Peter that's not enough. But just think for a moment. If somebody wronged you in the same way 7 times, how would you feel about that person? I think you'd be struggling, wouldn't you? And I think 7 times is a fairly generous offer. I know people who definitely would not extend forgiveness 7 times. But Jesus replies, no, not 7 times, but 77 times. And Jesus is using a form of language that was familiar in the day. And essentially, what he means by saying that is, Peter, your disposition towards others should be that no matter what they have done to you, you are willing to extend forgiveness to them. And no matter how many times they do it. Now, we're going to think maybe next week a little bit about what forgiveness is and what forgiveness isn't. I don't think Jesus means be a doormat and just let people walk all over you. But what he does mean is we never get to the point where we just write somebody off and judge them in our hearts. And he tells this story to illustrate it. And essentially what the story says, although he says it much better than just saying it in these words, is if God has forgiven you every wrong thing you've ever done on the cross of Jesus, at the cross of Jesus Christ, then you have no right to impose judgment on others, because your debt to God was far greater than anyone else's debt to you. And so Jesus, just with razor logic, says, if you are a Christian, if you have come to the knowledge of Jesus Christ and you have been forgiven of all that you've done wrong on the cross, then you can never then turn to your neighbour and refuse to extend to them what God has extended to you. So our basic disposition towards other people should be personal security, because our relationship with God is right, and so at the foundation level, all is well in our world. We don't need to prove ourselves. We don't need to put others down. We don't need to win, because we are already secure with God. And then our disposition towards others should be grace, long-sufferingness, and forgiveness. The foundation of Christian experience is the cross of Christ. The start of Christian experience is when we come and we kneel at the cross and we seek forgiveness for all our shortcomings, our wrong attitudes, our wrong actions, which, if we are prepared to be honest, are manifold. That is the beginning of Christian experience. There is no authentic Christian experience unless it starts there. But once it's started there, it then triggers a new disposition towards other people. The philosopher Nietzsche, a German philosopher, I think correctly looked at the world around him and said, do you know what? Once you observe how nature works and you observe the fundamental biological laws of the universe, everything is just conflict. He described it as will to power. He said everything from the simplest organisms, they are competing for scarce resources and trying to prosper themselves. And in order to do so, they have to compete against others and they have to win. And you could certainly find self-help gurus who are going to teach you the same thing nowadays. That life is conflict. You've got to recognize it, you've got to man up, or whatever the gender inclusive term for that is, and you have got to face it, you've got to assert yourself. And in contrast to that, the cross of Jesus Christ says that is how things are under the sun, unless you invite God into your life. And what God has revealed at the cross is that actually there is a much better way than just surrendering to yourself to a life of constant conflict in which the answer is to say, well, it's a dog-eat-dog world and I'm going to make sure I win. Christ says, yes, it will descend into a dog-eat-dog world if you don't turn to me. But if you turn to me, actually the law, instead of the law of conflict, becomes the law of love. And God the Father gives his seal of approval to the sacrifice of Jesus by raising him from the dead and saying that there is a deeper law at work in the world than conflict, and that is the law of love. And if you will follow love, if you will follow the law of love, then you, like Jesus, can look forward to resurrection life. But in this world, nevertheless, Jesus himself faced moments when he had to confront people. And this is the key practical question, really. At what point do I stop being patient with someone and overlooking their faults and decide to confront them? And that is a challenging question. I don't think there's any book I've ever read or even any guidance in the Bible that just gives you a simple answer to that question. I have met people, Christians, non-Christians, and by temperament, some would never confront. And some take the view, at the first sign of trouble, I confront. And it seems to me we can both recognize that a simple answer like that can't be right. It must be somewhere between the two. And the key thing we need is wisdom. How we need wisdom, when you think in your workplace and you think in your friendship group or even your family, sadly, we can have the most horrendous conflict at times in our families. And it's a particular role for leadership in any organisation, because we're responsible, if we're in leadership, for the health of that organisation. And we can't just shrug our shoulders and walk away from difficult situations. We've got to do our best to confront and resolve them. For me, one question that I ask myself when considering a difficult situation and considering whether I need to confront it is to ask myself this: if I go on tolerating this, am I tolerating the intolerable? These are subjective questions. I'm not saying that gives you a ready answer. But that, for me, if I prayerfully consider that, begins to help me think through whether I need to. And sometimes you know intuitively when something has got to the point where it cannot carry on. I think particularly when you observe, and particularly if you're in leadership, this is true, third parties suffering injustice or worse, abuse, then you no longer have the freedom to tolerate what's going on. And I would encourage prayer. I'm sure all of you can reflect on conflicts you've had, maybe conflicts that are going on in your own life, and trying to grapple with, what do I say? These things are not easy. They require tremendous wisdom. And actually prayer is one of the key things we desperately need for God to give us the grace and the wisdom to deal with some of these most difficult situations that we face. So we have a basic disposition towards others of patience, tolerance, forgiveness, grace. But when we face difficult situations, we reflect and prayerfully ask the question, do I need to confront this? The third then question is, if you've decided you do need to confront something, how do you do it? And there is no simple answer to this either. I remember Mike Tyson, when he was at the peak of his boxing powers, was Everybody was coming up with a plan to defeat Mike Tyson, and one after another they went into a ring with a plan and they came out flat on their backs. And somebody said to him about the latest opponent he was about to demolish, this person maybe's got a plan to take you on, Mike. What do you think his plan might be? And Mike Tyson said, everyone's got a plan until they get smacked in the face. I don't know about you, if I've geared myself up to confront somebody over something, you know, my plan normally doesn't sort of endure past the first sentence or two. And it's difficult. But here are my suggestions to you if you find yourself in a position when you have to confront somebody that you love and that you care about. And the first thing is to show humility. Prepare yourself spiritually in prayer and acknowledge before God, and I would suggest right at the start of the conversation with the other person, that you yourself are not perfect, that you failed many times, and that you are not out to judge them, but you want to try and resolve something. An absolutely excellent principle, and this came out of a book that I read. You'll find it on my blog, on the website, if you look for it, which is called Blessed Are the Peacemakers, are these words: speak to the right person in the right way. That is a very good principle when we're dealing with conflict. Human nature, when we're dealing with conflict, is somebody's upset us, we're not happy with somebody's behaviour, and instead of speaking to them, we speak to just about everybody else around the situation apart from them. That's gossip. It's generally speaking not the right thing to do. It's going to inflame the situation, and that's not the way Jesus outlines here. Jesus outlines in this section dealing with sin in the church, a slow escalation that starts with a personal conversation with the person whose behaviour is concerning you, and you gradually ramp that up to include more people in the conversation if they will not listen. And I think that escalation should be slow. We should be I mean, there are situations where things need to be dealt with very quickly, particularly if there's abusive situations. But more generally, we can afford to take things one step at a time, slowly, recognizing that you've always got the choice to hold off, but once something has been said, it can never be unsaid. Now, in conclusion, in my experience, this is a very messy business, and who here is going to claim that, you know, every conflict they've ever touched, they've just dealt with it smoothly and it's always been resolved with no hurt feelings? That's not the human condition, is it? And that's not true outside of the church. It's not true, sadly, in the church. Who hasn't made mistakes in this? And I just want to encourage you, if you have experienced that, particularly in the church, please don't just withdraw. That's not the answer. Sometimes, where there is abuse, or for the sake of one's own health, it is necessary to withdraw from a particular relationship. We see that in the Bible. Paul and Barnabas went their separate ways. And sadly, this side of heaven, even with Christians, at times, that's the way it has to be. But mostly we are called, even with those we struggle with, to go on loving and showing loving and truthful engagement as best we can. I want to say one final thing. Jesus, the people who love you most are the people who can speak the most truth to you. We discovered that last week. And we know that Jesus loves us more than anyone else. And he's proven that by his sacrifice for us. And that opens up channels of influence because he can speak to us and we know he's not out to get us. And we can follow his example in this. If you want to be a peacemaker, the first step is to earn the right to speak by your acts of love and your kindness to others and the way in which you show commitment to others so that they cannot doubt that you are acting in their best interests. So earn the right to speak. Be prayerful. Be patient. And then when you do need to speak and it becomes clear you need to speak to somebody, do so with humility, but also with the courage. Appeal to them as a fellow sinner. And may God give you the greatest wisdom to manage this. And if, like me, you've got situations you look back on with great sadness, conflicts that have just gone wrong and never healed, then do be encouraged that God is bigger than those conflicts. And even where we fail, his grace is much stronger. God bless you.